All right, today we're diving into a really radical idea from an ancient text that asks us to completely rethink the foundations of our economy. It's a concept called Jubilee, and it proposes nothing less than a scheduled 50-year reset for what it describes as a world trapped in bondage. So let's just kick things off with the huge question at the heart of all this. What if debt wasn't a life sentence? Seriously, what if the entire economic game board was just wiped clean every once in a while so a new generation could start fresh? This is the core challenge this whole idea puts on the table. Okay, so the first big problem this idea tackles is what the source sees as a key symptom of our modern world: permanent, inescapable debt. We're not just talking about a financial headache here. It's framed as a kind of modern-day servitude, something that can literally be passed down from parents to children. And, this naturally leads to the next issue: concentrated wealth. The argument is that the system, as it's set up, allows wealth, land, and all the things we need to be productive to just steadily flow away from the many and into the hands of a very, very small few. And the end game here? Well, according to the source, it's social fracture. When real economic opportunity starts to dry up and society hardens into these permanent classes of haves and have-nots, the very fabric holding us all together just starts to unravel. So we're looking at a world in bondage. But why? What's the real diagnosis here? The argument is that these problems we're seeing aren't just random economic trends. Nope, they all flow from one single core idea that, for the most part, we've totally forgotten. It all comes down to what the source calls a theological rebellion. And what does that mean? Well, it's basically the moment we humans start acting like we own everything: land, money, even ideas, forever and with no strings attached. We forget that maybe we're just supposed to be caretakers or stewards for a little while. And this one little shift in thinking, it triggers this whole domino effect, this social cascade. First, you get unchecked accumulation. That gives creditors permanent power over debtors. Soon, families have no choice but to sell off their own labor just to get by. Social mobility just grinds to a halt. And before you know it, society is hardened into these rigid, permanent classes. All right, so if that's the sickness, what's the cure? Well, the source pulls out this really ancient, really radical prescription: an economic reset button they call the Jubilee. And look, this Jubilee idea isn't just some nice, friendly suggestion. The text frames it as a core, foundational law. It's basically an institutional failsafe designed to stop our own human temptations from turning our economic systems into these giant machines of extraction. And here's the kicker: this thing wasn't random. It wasn't arbitrary. It was baked right into the calendar every 50 years. Like clockwork, a predictable legal reset. So what actually happened during this reset? It wasn't some vague concept. It was three very specific, incredibly powerful actions. First, poof, all debts were just canceled, gone. Second, all land, the main way people made a living, was returned to its original family stewards. And third, anyone who had been forced to sell themselves into labor to pay off a debt was set free. It was a complete and total system reboot. Now, this is a really crucial point. The source draws a hard line between Jubilee and charity. Look, charity is amazing and necessary. It helps people who are getting hurt by the system right now. But Jubilee is different. It's about fixing the rules of the system itself so that hopefully less charity is needed in the first place. So you might be wondering, why? Why on earth would you need a reset this radical? Well, to get it, we have to look at the core idea that underpins the entire thing. It's this fundamental tension between two ways of seeing the world. It really boils down to this. On one side, you have the idea of permanent human ownership, the mindset of "this is mine forever," which leads to hoarding wealth for generations. On the other side, you have temporary divine stewardship, the mindset of "this is entrusted to me for a time," which encourages you to take care of it productively. And this whole worldview is anchored in this one powerful sentence from the source. It states that the fundamental starting point is that everything ultimately belongs to God. And if you start there, it means that any claim we humans have to property has to be, by its very nature, limited and temporary. Okay, but let's be real. This is an ancient idea. How could it possibly apply to our modern world? Well, to help us get our heads around it, the source uses a great metaphor. Think of capitalism less like a war and more like a sport that has a season and a rulebook. So think about it this way. Jubilee doesn't get rid of the game. Entrepreneurs still compete.
Innovators create wealth, winners get to win. But, and this is a big but, after a set season, a 50-year cycle, the rules level the playing field so new players always have a fair shot. The point of the game becomes creating widespread flourishing, not just building untouchable dynasties.
So what would a society built on this idea actually look like? Well, you'd start to see some really fascinating features pop up. Things like debt being seasonal, not a curse you inherit. Shorter time limits on massive family fortunes. Term limits on monopolies over critical resources or patents. And maybe even treating big ideas less like private property forever and more like gifts that eventually get shared with everyone. And this brings us to the stakes, because this whole idea isn't presented as some gentle, feel-good proposal. It's framed as a stark choice, a fork in the road for our society with incredibly high stakes. The source even pulls in this ancient warning, framing the decision to embrace Jubilee-like principles as nothing less than a choice between social life and social death. It's a call to actively choose the path that leads to renewal. And what this boils down to are two very different paths forward. On one side, you have the path of injustice. You let inequality get entrenched, resentment builds up like a pressure cooker, and eventually it explodes in a violent, messy correction. The other path is Jubilee. It's a kind of preventive justice that channels all that social energy into peaceful renewal, stability, and human flourishing. And so, that's where we're left, with this massive question. Is this ancient blueprint for a self-correcting society just a radical fantasy, something that belongs in a history book? Or does it hold a necessary, maybe even essential, key to creating a more just and stable future? That's the question the source leaves us all to grapple with.